Good morning, everyone. My name is Tarun Chhabra. I'm a fellow here in the Brookings Foreign Policy program. Thanks for tuning in for this discussion about the postdoctoral fellowship program at Brookings in our foreign policy program. I'm excited to have today with us two of our current postdoctoral fellows, Katie Collin and Tori Tausig. Last year's postdoctoral fellow and a current fellow at Brookings, Chris Messerol. And we're also joined by Kevin Scott, who's the Director of Administration here at Brookings Foreign Policy. So I thought we'd start out by introducing each of our panelists today here. Each of them will tell you a little bit about how they ended up at Brookings, what they're working on now. Please tweet any questions using the hashtag Brookings postdoc, no hyphen. We'll follow that. You can also use the function that on Google that you're using to watch this as well. We'll be monitoring questions. But why don't we start with Tori, if you don't mind, and then we'll go to Katie and then to Chris.
Great. Thank you very much, Tarun. As Tarun mentioned, my name is Tori Tausig. I recently finished my PhD at the Fletcher School at Tufts University in Boston. My dissertation research focused on authoritarianism and in Russia and China and the implications of domestic politics on their foreign policy strategy. I've been continuing work on this subject as a postdoc. Writing on the Brookings blog platform, working on 2 monographs for the foreign policy program. But to give a brief background on my last few years, I've been at Fletcher. I was at Fletcher since 2012, where I did the master's program prior to starting in the PhD program. And I was actually a pre-doctoral fellow at Brookings last year, and then applied and have stayed on for this coming year as a postdoc fellow. And I'm happy to answer any questions on the application process and the experience at Brookings, and look forward to your questions.
Great. Katie, over to you.
All right, good morning. I'm Katie Collin, and I'm the other postdoctoral fellow at Brookings. I spent several years working with the United Nations in peace operations on electoral administration before I returned and got my PhD at American University at the School of International Service in international relations. So my dissertation research is on the use of referendums in peace processes. And so at Brookings, I am, as Tori is, working on a pair of monographs, and one is on the policy implications for using referendums in peace processes, or the interconnections between direct democracy, peacemaking, and conflict. I'm also working at Brookings on some projects on conflict prevention and post-conflict stabilization. So that is mostly me in a nutshell. It's been an exciting fall for peace, conflict, and referendums.
All right, thank you, Katie. Chris?
I'm Chris Messerol. I'm currently a fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy here at Brookings. But I started out as a predoctoral fellow and then was a postdoctoral fellow last year, and had a really wonderful experience with both of those fellowships. My doctoral research was on basically the causes and consequences of religious and sectarian violence, and I used a lot of basically machine learning and data science techniques to get more and newer insights into what might be driving a lot of the radicalization and extremism that we see in the Middle East and elsewhere. And so in line with the dissertation work I did, I'm currently still doing a lot of data science and work on violent extremism now that I'm a fellow. I'm also involved excuse me, involved with some different projects related to technology more broadly, and the effect that emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning and big data will have on our foreign policy. So I'll be glad to talk more about that later, but that's a brief intro to what I'm doing.
Great. So I thought a question that's probably on the minds of a lot of folks who are applying or considering applying is why Brookings? There are many postdoctoral opportunities. Most of them are at universities associated with political science departments, history departments, or interdisciplinary centers at universities. So I thought it'd be useful if each of you would say a little bit about why you chose to come to Brookings, what about it appealed to you, and then now that you've been here for a bit, some of you for more than a couple of years, how you found it to be different from a university environment. So, Chris, do you want to start off there, and then we'll go
sure.
back.
So I should start by saying that when I first applied, I was interested. I kind of had a sneaking suspicion that academia, as much as I enjoyed it, I wasn't sure I was fully ready to commit to like a career in academia. And I was very curious to see what it actually was like to work in the policy space. And in particular, if I found that work to be in some ways kind of more challenging or more gratifying than an academic environment. And in my case, I think I quickly discovered that I did enjoy the policy space a little bit more than I enjoyed the academic one. And so, and I think Brookings was really foundational in making that discovery for myself. But I think that said, one of the reasons I stuck around was realizing that Brookings is really probably unique among all the think tanks in DC in terms of how you can position yourself to have one foot in academia and another in the policy landscape. So I'm not somebody who would want to leave academia behind, especially since I do a lot of data science and machine learning, where you really do have to have one foot in the academic world and staying current in what the latest techniques are, what the latest research questions are. But the excuse me, the advantage for being at Brookings is that it gives you a really unique lay of the land in terms of how policy is made and the ability to kind of influence or be a part of the policy conversations on topics that you care about. So in my case, I care a lot about the substantive area that I care a lot about is violent extremism, radicalization, and counterterrorism. If I were in academia, there's just a lot of conversations that I would not be a part of in DC, be it at going to advise the State Department or other members of the defense and intelligence communities, all the actors that are actually setting and implementing our current counterterrorism and counter-extremism policy. If you're in academia, it's hard to be consistently a part of those conversations, whereas at Brookings, it's the great privilege of being here is that you can actually take part in those conversations and in meaningful ways. More broadly, to kind of zoom out a little bit, I guess I'll Tori and Katie might have their other thoughts on how academia and the policy world are a little bit different. My read on it for anyone who's watching that's coming from more of like a quantitative political science background is that a lot of the political science that I was trained in was very focused on understanding causal counterfactuals, right? Like if we if we have this voter registration policy, how many more people will vote? If we have this counterterrorism policy, how many more people will we capture, or how many fewer people might die in a given conflict? And those are all, I think, hugely important questions about how the world works and how politics works. The policy is a little bit different in the sense that in academia, you're really concerned with kind of making causal inferences and making it as tight and as perfect as you can. The policy world is a little bit messier in the sense that, if you're the White House and you have to have a counterterrorism policy in the Middle East, you don't have time. The perfect academic project is to go figure out, okay, well, let's collect data on every conflict that's happened in the Middle East and see exactly how many people died when there was this policy versus another policy. And unfortunately, we don't really have that luxury in the policy world. And so the question is coming, of the policies that we think might be relevant, which ones matter the most? And those take into account a lot of strategic and moral and ethical questions that a purely kind of causal or counterfactual logic won't necessarily take into account. So that to me anyway, after having been here for a couple of years, is probably the biggest difference between what I do here and what I did in academia when I was going to academic conferences, where it's really just much more technical than it is in a policy environment. Again, I can go on at length about this, but I'll let Katie and Tori have an opportunity as well.
Thanks, Chris. Katie, over to you.
Well, I'd like to echo a lot of what Chris said about the normative context and the fact that policy maybe is a little bit messier. But I would add that I spent a good amount of time in the field as a practitioner. And so coming to academia, I was expecting to be, an engaged scholar or a scholar practitioner. And so Brookings was what I thought was a natural fit for me. And I'm not necessarily interested in being an academic who isn't part of that conversation that Chris is describing. And on the other hand, since coming to Brookings, I've really learned that I need to draw that distinction between policy work and practice, being in the field the way that I was in my previous life. It's a very different field. It is, in fact, closer to academia, but it is informed nonetheless, I think, by fieldwork and practice, also in interesting ways. So I find it's a new style of analysis and writing, but it's also synergistic in important ways. So I'm unexpectedly glad to be acquiring a new skill set.
Thanks. Tori?
Yeah, again, I echo everything that Chris and Katie said about the differences between being in an academic environment versus a policy environment. And just to discuss my background a little bit and why I was interested in Brookings, for me, being at the Fletcher School, which is a policy-oriented PhD program, much like a number of different PhD programs in the US, whether it's the Woodrow Wilson School or SAIS at Johns Hopkins or the Kennedy School at Harvard, there are these tracks where people at these schools are interested in moving into policy. And I think that going from that type of environment to a Brookings environment was a great segue because, again, I was interested in the policy background, and Brookings really sits at the intersection of policy and academia. And I find, just to say a few differences on the day-to-day experiences, whereas in an academic postdoctoral environment, you may be working on long-form journal articles, book proposals, book manuscripts, all of which you can do at Brookings. I think we're more likely here, and what I found I spend most of my time on is writing shorter form op-ed or blog pieces, which Brookings gives you a platform to work on, writing these monographs, as Katie mentioned, that will go onto the Brookings website or be transmitted to a policymaking audience. It's all, I find, one step closer to an audience that I would like to reach with my own research. And then just a brief note on who we're engaging with at Brookings every day, I find is slightly different than a university environment. A number of the Brookings employees and staff and fellows all have, or a number of them have, government experience. And so going to roundtables and workshops and events with people who are using their experiences to inform their research, I found to be a very rich and dynamic environment. So for all those reasons, I think that Brookings is slightly different from a university environment. That does not mean you can't work on a book if you wanted to, but the types of publications and the audiences you're engaging with on a daily basis, you're just one step closer to the policy world. In fact, you're in the policy world being in Washington and just engaging with people who come through the door at Brookings, and then also having the flexibility to run around town if you want to different conferences and think tank events, or as Chris mentioned, briefings with State Department officials. Again, we're at this intersection of using academically informed and methodologically rigorous research, but applying that in a policy environment. So I found it very engaging and dynamic in that sense.
Great. And Tori, I'm glad you brought up the day-to-day, because I'd like to ask each of you if you could provide a little bit of color. What are the interactions that you have had with government officials or other policy officials? What do they look like? What kinds of roundtables or seminars discussing what, officials from what parts of the government, to just give people a little bit of a sense of the kinds of interactions that you've had since you've been here. And second, how have you tried to integrate yourself into the life of foreign policy, right? Is it through particular centers, or is it through relationships with particular fellows? If you could say a little bit about both, that'd be great. Chris, could we go back to you?
Yeah, sure. So the day-to-day is actually a little bit, I'm not sure what I fully envisioned when I first started, but it's a little bit different. I think I had kind of envisioned you just sit in your office and write all day. You sit in a tank and think, basically, right? And there is some of that, obviously, and there's as much of that as, with the postdoc, I think there would be as much of that as you wanted. But I think I quickly discovered that the real value for me and for what I got the most out of was actually interacting with other people in the space, both within Brookings and foreign policy and around town. And so the day-to-day ended up looking a little bit different, where there was a lot more meetings, a lot more roundtables. To get to Tarun's question about, I guess I'll focus on the external part, and then I'll focus on what it's like day-to-day within Brookings. But the meetings that you're a part of, one of the things I didn't realize before taking the position or the fellowship was that, I knew that there were a lot of public events in DC for policy issues that I cared about. But the public events that are kind of broadcast, around town publicly are really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of where the policy conversations are actually happening. There's a lot of, roundtables, think tanks, but also within government and within different key stakeholders like the World Bank, for example, or other NGOs, where there's a lot of people working on this space. Again, they come back to what I know best, radicalization and extremism. There's a lot of different stakeholders working on it. They'll often want to have kind of private sit-downs with just a handful of experts in the field to really talk through different programs they were thinking about implementing, or to talk through kind of a broader program they might be pitching with to their boss or to another, or maybe even the Congress. And what they want is just feedback on whether or not these programs or these policies or these strategies make sense. And it's very helpful for them, I think, to have experts in the room. And it's very, in my case, I find it really gratifying to be able to kind of go and have those conversations and be a part of helping policymakers settle and arrive on a good policy. So those are the policy conversations that I tend to have around town. There obviously are larger public events that I go to as well, but a lot of the ones that I find most valuable are actually just small gatherings of kind of like-minded people and experts. Within Brookings, foreign policy is really kind of a unique program within Brookings. In that it's probably, I believe it is by far the largest program at Brookings, and there's a lot that it has to offer, far more so than I think I was certainly aware of when I started. There's a number of different regional centers, but there's also just one of the things I've been consistently surprised by is the depth and breadth of expertise that so many of the fellows here have, where somebody might be like our lead fellow on India, but they also have this, terrorism isn't their primary concern, but they're very well versed in it because they have encounter it in their as a part of their primary concern. And what I found really valuable when I started here was developing some pretty close relationships with a couple of folks that I worked closely with on a couple of projects, and then really just trying to get to know as many people outside of I had probably 2 or 3 relationships with fellows that I was working closely with, and then on top of that, I tried to kind of reach out and have coffee and have lunch with different people around foreign policy that were doing interesting things. They may not have been directly what I was interested in, but I wanted to hear more about what they're doing. And more often than not, in those conversations, you end up discovering that there's some kind of common interest or project that you might share, and those conversations could be, pretty fruitful. And it means that you end up having a lot of coffee and a lot of lunches, and it can be a challenge to to leave it the same way as you entered. But it's been a great experience.
Okay, Katie.
So let's see. Day to day, how do you engage with the policy space? I would echo a lot of what Chris said, right? Just being in DC and having the freedom to organize your own time at Brookings means that you have access to a lot of conversations, both inside the building and around town. So for instance, right, I've said that I was working on conflict prevention and post-conflict stabilization, right? So this fall, the USIP has had a series of events on the World Bank UN report on conflict prevention rollout that have been really great to be able to be involved in or to attend. The head of UN peacekeeping was recently there, so I got to go and see him speak and meet him, which is both useful and interesting. One thing I would say is that, as Tori mentioned, Brookings gives you a platform to package your research around their blogs. And so this autumn, I put out a couple of pieces on the referendums in Iraq and Spain. And I had a lot of feedback from those, which I hadn't had publishing similar pieces on other platforms. And I was really able to engage with conversation around those events. Like I had media contacts coming to talk to me about how to understand these events, why they were happening, what the implications were in the coming days. So that was a level, taking my research to a very different level, and Brookings just opens that door. So that's an exciting example of the impact of being here.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add a few things to that in 2 parts. The first part, Tarun asked about engagement at Brookings, and I'll just say a few words about my own experience. I felt like I was a part of the Brookings community from day one. I came in for my first day, and Kevin Scott kindly meted me at the front door, and he walked me around and introduced me to everyone in the foreign policy program and all of the scholars that I would be working with. I was then affiliated, again from day one, with 2 different centers, regional centers at Brookings, based on my own research areas on Russia and China. And so I was affiliated with the Center on the U.S. and Europe, which I remain affiliated with today, and the China Center, and slightly less the East Asia Center, given my work on Asian security and Chinese foreign policy. So on that first day, I had lunch which was arranged for me, which was wonderful, with the assistant director from the Center on the U.S. and Europe and the assistant director from the China Center to talk about my research and how I could feed into the work that was already being done by fellows. And then I think the other part of that is being a little bit of a self-starter, and as Chris mentioned, understanding what fellows are working on and what you want to learn from them, how you want to be engaged with their own research. So that was the beginning, and then fairly or not fairly, I just started treating myself as an employee of Brookings and would go to staff meetings and pretend that I was integrally involved in all of the different events and roundtables. But I found that the more I wanted to be engaged at Brookings, the more receptive Brookings was as well, which again, I think speaks to the receptive and engaging nature of this organization and this community. So on a day-to-day basis, that involved sometimes it was reviewing or providing feedback on scholars' papers or research. It was being involved in some of the planning for public events we had. Over the last year, I moderated 2 public event panels, one on the future of NATO with Michael Hanlon and Steve Pfeiffer, and then another on Russian-Turkish relations. And both were really, I found, rewarding experiences in ways that I could try to grow in my own kind of presenting skills and research skills. So again, I think to the extent you want to be engaged at Brookings, you'll find a receptive audience. And then to Tarun's second point about what type of people we're engaging with here, you of course have world-renowned scholars working at Brookings who've come from the academic community or government, and then roundtables that Brookings have organized. I've been at recent roundtables with officials from the National Security Council seeking insight from think tanks on democracy, human rights, and governance issues. I've been at roundtables with, based on my regional focuses, National Intelligence Council officials working on Russian and Eurasian affairs, all interacting with people from the think tank and academic communities. So again, you really get to see that point of synergy that Brookings is working at. And I'm happy to talk more about meetings off-site as well, but maybe we get into that later.
That's great. Thanks very much. Sure. Let me ask you. Sorry, go ahead, Katie, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on what Tori is saying and return to our point about the differences between Brookings and academia, which is that Brookings is a really, really friendly environment, right? And if you go and engage, people are really happy to engage with you and give you very constructive feedback on your research and bring you into their research programs. And coming out of an academic setting where you're used to sitting down and having the priority be critique, it's a really different feeling. It's very welcoming, and the more you engage in this way that Tori and Chris are talking about, it's a really welcoming place that will be receptive to that kind of engagement.
Thanks, Katie. I want to ask you a little bit of a harder question, which is for people who are applying to this postdoc but are still pretty keen on staying in the world of academia. You know, is this a good idea? How would they approach the postdoc here? Is it something that you recommend for them? How would you encourage people to think about that particular question as they might be weighing offers both from Brookings and from university-based postdocs?
Well, we've had, I know the postdoc program at Brookings is relatively new, but Brookings has had pre-docs go into tenure track academic positions. Mm-hmm. And again, while this might not be the traditional experience where you are in an office all day working on a book manuscript or a proposal, in my opinion, your time here and engagement with the policy community, but also very people with staunch academic backgrounds, only informs research that you can then use in book manuscripts and then in an academic career moving on. But perhaps, since I don't have a tenure track position waiting for me at the end of this, perhaps Chris or Katie can illuminate more.
Katie, please, yeah.
Oh, if only I had a tenure track position waiting for me. But yeah, so my intention is to go back into the academic world, and to that end, I've been on the job market this fall, and I'm actually applying for another round of postdocs where I will hopefully write that book, right? I'll adapt my dissertation. So a couple of things. One is that the research that you do at Brookings will help you to write in a way that is going to make that process easier and better. And the writing itself is really good training. And second of all, you're going to be able to expand on your research in a way that will be useful for academic projects into the future. It's certainly it's an additional year for me. Certainly. However, I think that the training in terms of shaping questions, shaping research projects, expanding on your own research, and making your writing accessible to a variety of audiences is really valuable. And I certainly have a better grip on my own research moving into the future than I did a year ago.
Great. Thank you, Katie. Chris?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things I would say to that. I think, first of all, I think Brookings is a fantastic place to come if you do want to go back to academia as well. I think that there's two reasons I would say that. So one is just the logistics of the academic job market, where most of the positions are obviously very competitive and will require, maybe 2 or 3, sometimes even 3 or more publications just for a junior level tenure track position. But if you have, there's a lot of other, there are other folks coming out of PhD programs that will also have those publications, but there aren't many that will be able to differentiate themselves as having some kind of policy experience. And I talked extensively with my committee and with other advisors about what kind of my time at Brookings meant for my prospects on the academic job market. And they were all unanimous. Pretty much everybody I talked to was unanimous about the fact that it's a very strong signal and it's a very unique signal. Most hiring committees do want to be able to show to their, to the deans or the, higher ups within the university that the work they're doing is academically important, but that it's also socially important as well, and that there is kind of a policy dimension to it. So especially if you're applying to political science programs or public policy programs, and those are the kinds of academic jobs that you want, it's a really, assuming that you've got your other kind of academic bona fides in line, where you've got a couple publications in good journals, it's a really strong signal to also have some time at Brookings and to be able to draw on some of the networks that you've built here. So that's one way I think it makes you really stand out and be competitive. The other is just a much more subtle thing, and I think it would be long-term for your academic career, which is the more you interact with people in government and in the policy space, the more you'll discover interesting academic questions that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. I think that there's a lot of, academics can kind of get lost in their own methodology sometimes, their own theories sometimes, and it's very easy to lose sight of what is, what policy is and is not capable of, what the state is or is not capable of. The more you're plugged into the actual policy questions, the more you'll see new, promising kind of avenues for your own research, and the more it'll be guided by kind of the empirics of your, informal experience. So we've obviously sung the praises of the policy world early on in this chat, but I would be very remiss if anybody watched this and thought they could go back to academia, because I think it would be a fantastic experience for anyone who wants to go back.
And would you, Chris, would you say, and then I want to go back to Tori, because we were talking about this a little bit before we went live here, but a little bit about what kind of activities do you have with people who have a foot in the academic world, university-based scholars? What kind of work have you done with them? What kind of events have you attended here with them? Obviously, we have people like Dan Byman, who is a faculty member at Georgetown, is also a fellow here, and he's not alone. But if you could say a little bit about, each of you could say a little bit about that, that'd be cool.
So I think there's kind of two things that I would say to that. One is that there's kind of informal conversations I've had. One thing I've discovered is that a lot of academics, especially once they become associate professor or full professor, they've kind of, they're secure in tenure, basically. Not all of them, but many of them will start to, at least within political science, will start to care more about the policy dimension to what they're doing. And a lot of them are very curious about how to get involved in policy conversations. And so I've reached out to a number of folks in the fields that I've been working in. And almost uniformly, even if they're very senior people, they're very responsive and engaged with me. And I think partly there's a kind of, especially for the academics that are not located in DC or even New York, there's a lot of curiosity about what the policy world is like, and it's very much the conversations I've had with them where I've been trying to understand something about some of the academic research that they've done, and they're kind of curious about the policy world and how the two can intersect. And so those conversations have been really kind of fruitful and rewarding. The other is a more structured environment where I recently put together a panel or just a small roundtable in Brookings. We're trying to come up with a better data set around political violence, and I was kind of blown away by the responsiveness of the academic community to be willing to come to DC and engage in a conversation about what kind of political violence do we have, what kind of political violence do policymakers actually need, what would be the best way about gaining the knowledge, the data that we currently don't have. For me, it was tremendously valuable to be able to call on some academics with deep, just massively deep technical expertise on some of these questions. And I would hope that for them it was kind of a unique experience, to be able to engage with the policy community and see kind of, I think a lot of, especially because I work on some of the data science issues, it's not always clear what the upstream policy implications of your work are. But for the folks who are working on some really technical questions, it was actually, I think, gratifying for them just to be able to see that there is a policy dimension to what they're doing. So that's just kind of one example. I think there's, for other areas of foreign policy that, maybe aren't quite as technically oriented, there are still, pretty much any area, would be a grand strategy, be it trade policy, any area of international relations, for example, most academics, I think, would have some immediate policy tie-in that any of the conversations I've been a part of, they'd be gratified to be a part of those conversations.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the enthusiasm with which often we have academics coming here, because we're just doing a workshop tomorrow, as you all know, with the Tobin Project and the Carnegie Endowment, where we're focusing on the policy implications of recent scholarship in international history and politics. And we have some very senior historians and political scientists coming on, unfortunately, somewhat short notice, but they're all coming, which I'm thrilled about. So I found the same to be true. Tori, do you want to say something on this as well?
Yeah, I was going to bring up this conference that we have going on tomorrow, which I think it's going to be a really interesting event because, as Tarun mentioned, we have scholars, political scientists, international historians who are on panels moderated by former or current government officials. And so we are, and I've been reviewing some of the papers for it tomorrow, cutting edge scholarship in this field in an environment where you're having scholars and current government officials at the table, so that scholars can get a better sense of what types of tools are needed to implement some of the research that they're working on the policy level, and then also policymakers better understand the questions that are being asked and the methodological tools that are being used in the academic community. So that's a really interesting illustration. I also went to a workshop, a fairly small roundtable a couple months ago that was organized by the International Order and Strategy Group here at Brookings and Princeton University's Wilson School, and I apologize, I forget the other sponsor, but it was on kind of this conceptual notion of the future of the liberal international order. And we had government officials at the table who were working on U.S. national security strategy, but then also a great debate going on between John Eikenberry and Bob Kagan, who have interesting and at times opposing views about how the U.S. should be engaged as a global leader in the international order. And so, again, it's another interesting illustration of scholars debating at tables at Brookings with current government officials. So those are just two examples that I have off the top of my head now.
Great, Katie, do you want to add on this?
I would echo most of what Chris and Tori have to say on that. I'm the people that I've worked with most closely at Brookings have been non-resident fellows, right, who are actively doing research for Brookings while they are also doing academic research. So, for example, one of the projects that I've been collaborating on, we're trying to spin out two products, right? One that's like a briefing paper that will go to a policy, and another that we can turn into an academic piece, right? So it's nice to do a certain set of research and then look at it with these two lenses on and have both of those products and see what the differences are. I would add that it's made me more confident in shopping my own research to policy circles. For example, reaching out to the Electoral Assistance Division at the Secretariat in New York to let them know, like, this is what I'm researching. It has to do with what you are putting out into the field. And if there's future opportunities for us to collaborate, please bear that in mind, you know, and sending my research out to people who are in the field doing the work that I'm talking about, right? So these people aren't only my research subjects, they're also my former colleagues, but also people who are receptive to and putting into practice in an immediate way the things that I am working on. So that's been a nice confidence booster. Like I said, it's really allowed me to close the loop on a couple of those items.
That's great. Well, I think we'll wrap up here in a few minutes. Before I do, I wanted to ask each of you, since you were all successful applicants, any advice on, as you're finalizing applications, any words of advice for how to shape the application in any way? Chris, you want to start with you?
I'll jump in. I mean, I should specify I have not been on a committee that reviews these applications, but I was, you know, I was told that I think one of the things that made my application originally stand out was the questions that I asked were academically informed, but they were written in a way that was clear and concise and accessible to non-experts in the field that I was working in. And so I think one of the traps that academics often fall into is that they'll use the jargon and kind of very technical vocabulary of their specific subfields within academia, and forget that for a non-expert, that's not probably the best way to explain, you know, their field. You know, like questions of, you know, phrases like causal identification, for example, are great phrases to drop into a academic paper or a dissertation. They're less successful if you're dropping them into an op-ed or to, you know, Foreign Policy magazine. And by extension, I would encourage, you know, the writing. You know, I think there is like a writing sample. I think if it's part of it is your dissertation, that's fine. But for the, you know, kind of the statement of purpose and for some of the research questions that you lay out, you know, what you would want to work on, just work hard to make them as clear and compelling to a broad policy audience as you can, because, you know, odds are most of the people on the reviewing committee might not necessarily share your, you know, regional or subfield expertise. So it has to be able to resonate broadly with pretty much anybody who's studying foreign policy writ large.
That will again be true this year, so that's very good advice. Tori?
Yeah, I think two things would be helpful to keep in mind on the application. One is how your research aligns with a certain region, center focus at Brookings, and how it fits into the overall policy program agenda that Brookings has. So getting a sense of where your work fits into the environment here, so that the committee has a sense of where your work fits in and what type of center you would be affiliated with. So if you're working on a more conceptual piece, again, tying that to a certain region or center analysis, and obviously not changing the focus of your research, but showing how it fits into the overall Brookings agenda and foreign policy program would be helpful. And second, to follow up on what Chris said, focusing on not just analysis, but implications. When I did my application to Brookings, and then also when I presented at Brookings, I found that all of the focus I had on analysis was followed up with questions on, okay, what does this mean for U.S. foreign policy? How can policymakers use this information? So always keeping in mind the implications of your research and what type of recommendations might flow for that would be helpful when you outline your two research project proposals.
Great. Katie, any final words? Anything we haven't covered here? Additional advice?
I would say when you're writing your research proposal, right, that you're shaping it around 2 projects, and that's really the same in most postdocs, right? You're going to write about what you're currently researching and what you want to research for the future, right? So figure out what the policy implications are for your current research, your dissertation research, and that should be a product that you can produce for Brookings, right? And then the next step is to think about what further research you want to do while you're here. And as Tori said, tie it to the research projects that are already going on or the research directions, right? So that you can contribute to the overall research that's going on in Brookings, and that you get back because you can engage more fully with the scholars that are here already. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Okay, great. Well, unless there's anything else that you all would like to add, I think we'll close here. I'll just remind everyone that the deadline for applications is January 8th, and the deadline for letters of recommendation is on January 22nd. But please email any questions that you might have. Kevin will answer them with alacrity, as he always does, and we look forward to reading applications. Thank you all for joining us.